welcome to our Stop the Rot webinar. I'm Tim Rushent and I'll be looking after you today. If we just wait a couple more seconds for our remaining attendees to join us, then we'll get started. Hopefully you should all see the title slide that we've got here there. If you can't, then just let us know in the chat, but we should be okay. Okay, well, look, I'm going to get cracking. As I said, I'm Tim Rushent. I'm the Director of Digital here at Crown. This is the Stop the Rot webinar. The topic of redundant, obsolete and trivial data is something we wanted to discuss with as many people as we could. This is something that really does affect all businesses, whether they're small or large. It impacts the cost of doing business and it introduces compliance risks, disrupts our service and impacts our ability to find the right version of the information that we need to work with. What we're going to do today is explore the impact of this, share some advice on what can be done about it, but also have a bit of a conversation and engage in that conversation. Now, if I quickly just share the agenda, you can see what we're going to be talking about here. We're going to be doing some introductions. We're going to be talking about the definition and understanding what we mean by ROT, redundant, obsolete and trivial data. We'll be looking at the hidden risks, and we'll then be turning to think about some of the solutions. So what can we do about it? What's practical? That will then lead us into us sharing our top 10 tips of what can be done about it, but then hopefully we'll have some interactive Q&A and we'll get the conversation going. By means of introduction, I'm Tim Rushent. As I said, I'm the Director of Digital here at Crown. For around 30 years, I've been working with many organisations really to help them adapt to the changing needs of their customers and markets. And this is continuing here in Crown as we help our customers making it simpler for them to navigate an increasingly demanding information management landscape. One of those challenges which is becoming increasingly prevalent is the one we'll be talking today, but also this is really a branch of the broader compliance topics such as subject access requests, security, compliance and other things that we all have to deal with. Now, I'm joined today by my colleague, Sherratt, and I'll let Ian introduce himself.
Great, thanks, Tim. Hello, everybody. A warm welcome to the webinar. My name is Sherratt. I'm Head of Market Development and the Chief Technology Officer for Folding Space. We're an organisation that ostensibly is interested and deals with data in various forms. And today, really, I think the topic of interest is how do we deal with that redundant, obsolete and trivial data. So that's one of Folding Space's areas of expertise. So yeah, that's me. I'm looking forward to the conversation with Tim.
Thanks, Ian. One point of housekeeping, anyone who's on the call would like to ask any questions, if you put them in the chat, then we can get to them later on. You can see here we're sharing a poll with you. What we're going to be talking about first of all is what the definition is of ROT. So I'm interested to understand a little quiz here. If you could help us out by answering this little poll over the next 30 or so seconds, that will help us with the next bit of the conversation.
Let's see how many people know what it is.
Right, we got any answers yet? Background team?
Yeah, hi, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah, yeah, lots of answers, and so far 100% correct. So
They know why they're here. That's good.
well, there's a surprise. I mean, from Ian, from your point of view, it'd
Yeah.
be helpful if you run us through what we mean and what the different categories are.
Yeah, sure, Tim. So I think it's an interesting term, rot. It kind of a useful little acronym, isn't it, to say rot? But actually, there's a couple of additional elements that we here at Folding Space consider when we're looking at data in organizations. So redundant is the first thing. Data that exists in your environment but really doesn't have a great deal of purpose, either because it's become of an age where its purpose is lost, or in its essence itself, that data is no longer valuable to the business. And that also speaks a little to the category of obsolete. So data that is of an age where it's no longer relevant. And then trivial data, and there's all kinds of trivial data. We all create trivial data all day, every day. So those are the sort of three key things: redundant data, obsolete data, trivial data. But interestingly, there's a couple of other little categories tucked away in there that I like to talk about as well, Tim. And that adds two more categories to rot, and rather usefully ends up almost spelling rotten, although not spelled correctly. The first additional category is unnecessary. So data that we store and keep that really doesn't need to be stored and kept, which clearly has a cost. And then the category which is sort of, I guess, as a headline, called naughty, which can be all kinds of things that businesses shouldn't really need or be storing. And it can be everything from the obvious definition of naughty through to things like games and other things that just should not be on the company network. So rot, redundant, obsolete, and trivial data. And then two more: U, unnecessary, and N, naughty, we call it. Just anything that really shouldn't be there on that corporate network, but unfortunately probably is in most cases tucked away in the deep dark depths of the shared network. So that's that, Tim.
Yeah. So given that definition, then why does it matter? Because it seems to me that a lot of organisations are living with this day in, day out.
They are. I think matter falls into different categories depending on who's asking the question. So clearly, from a business leadership point of view, the first thing is going to be the cost of storing that information that isn't being particularly used, and of course is being backed up. So you don't just have one copy. You've probably got a copy in as many areas as there are departments. You've probably got several copies cascading out through your backups. And so to be honest, rot is about two things, really. It's about cost and it's about risk. So it is about what the data is, but it's also about where it is. And largely we're talking here, Tim, about unstructured data. So we're not talking about the data that sits in your databases and systems of record. That's really not where rot lives. Typically, those systems have structure to them. They only allow you to store data in a structured way, and typically they're often the lifeblood of the business as well. So they're the things that help you drive and run your business. What I'm talking about here really is the data that exists outside of that becomes aged, becomes out of date, but we still keep it because the housekeeping around it is often tricky. Certainly in larger organizations, the housekeeping around that data is tricky, but it grows. And you're seeing there a quarter to almost a third of all of that data will either be classified as rot, so either redundant, obsolete, or trivial data, but it's still costing the business money to keep that data. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is managing it is quite tricky, isn't it? Because different departments will have different data dependencies. So not all data is created equal, I think, is what I'm saying here too. Certain data runs the business, but an awful lot of data that's created either has a very short shelf life or is relevant only to a specific action or activity. And typically that data is created but is never got rid of in any meaningful way. And then if you add to that the challenge from an IT perspective of where do you put that, where do you keep it all? So there's a cost associated with this as well, because you've got to put it somewhere. And then also sitting right alongside that is the risk of storing this data over an extended period of time in parts of the network, potentially where some of that data should not be. So there is two things. There's the cost, obviously. There's the data risk of that data sitting towards the edges of the network and in places it shouldn't be. And then, of course, as well, there's the whole question of, to use the unnecessary, naughty element of it, data being stored that just should not be on a business network at all, and has arrived there for reasons various over an extended period of time. So really, the ROTAN is kind of an important acronym, really, because it is that redundant data that no longer has value, that obsolete data that's aged and therefore does not have currency, or indeed the value it once had. Trivial data, the kind of stuff that's created all the time, and some of that is created by programs too. Let's be honest, applications do create temporary files and things like that cause trivial data to be generated, and then unnecessary data that really shouldn't be on the corporate network at all, or copies of data. Multiple copies of data often exist, so you'll have the same data time and time again in different silos within the organization. And then finally, of course, there is the category of naughty, which is data that just shouldn't be on the network at all, and definitely wouldn't be welcomed by most senior leaders. But what this is about, really, Tim, in that ROTAN now extension to ROT, is just how many businesses truly understand what their exposure to this is, because data loss is a challenge. But also we're talking about the whole corporate bit really here. We're talking about the cost of doing this. We're talking about the risk of doing this, storing data across the network in categories that haven't been tested for a very long time. So it's common for businesses to kind of to have departmental areas within the network where accounts or sales or other teams operate. And people come and leave an organization, and this grows at a quite significant rate, and most organizations struggle with management of it, because if you didn't create it, are you going to be the person that deletes it? And what this is all about, Tim, really, to cut to the essence here, this is all about understanding what you've got so that you can make effective decisions about what to do with it. And that is not always to delete it, of course, but without the insight, how do you know? And the answer is you don't, probably.
So, Ian, we'll talk about the scale of the problem in a minute, but a couple of things that you were saying there were fascinating, because I'm interested in what the knock-on effect is. Of course, one example that's in my head at the moment, if you're storing too much information and you're smothering your cloud storage and your hard drives and local drives with that, surely an implication of that is that you're not going to be able to find the information you need to do your work. So let alone the considerations of compliance, but if you've got too much stuff there and too many duplications, how are you going to find things?
Exactly, and this becomes the problem with the modern way of working. Really, this is all about data is easy to create, isn't it? But data is not all data is not created equal, Tim, as I know you'll be very aware, and in that scenario, also data has a life, doesn't it? Right? We don't recognize actually the relevance, the purpose of data has a lifespan. So some data lifespans can be incredibly short. If you produce a spreadsheet for a meeting, let's just say, and the subject matter of that meeting specific, you create a spreadsheet to show your leaders and colleagues, that point in time, really, once that meeting's over, that data is end of life. It probably won't be referred to or used again. Multiply that by the number of people in an organization, and let's be honest, the relative ease with which that kind of data can be created. And it isn't hard to understand how quite quickly you'd lose track of where some of those things were, first of all. And then, when the business says to IT, it's we need some more storage, rarely is the question asked about actually IT, can we find out what we currently store, just to see what the relevance and value of that is to the business. And of course, we're not just talking about the data that's available for you to browse, right, on your company network. We're also talking about that data is also impacting the size and the time frame for your backups, There's a cost element to this. Storing trivial information has a cost. Storing all information has a cost. So what you're looking at is, not unusually for most organizations, a sort of concatenation over many years of that don't delete anything kind of mentality, because none of us like to delete something just in case we ever need it. And then, what that leads to over time is that redundant, obsolete, trivial data in the network at significant proportion, and the business is then looking to go out and procure more place to store data that's relevant to it. So it has several knock-on effects. There's a cost implication. There's the ability to find things implication, which you've just highlighted. It becomes harder to find things the more things you have to look through to find those things. And then also, there is the data risk elements to this. There is an environmental risk, that what we would refer to as the risk surface of the business exists in data. We are seeing more and more organizations that are being attacked now. I know we're going to come on to talk about that, so I won't dwell on it. And at that point, knowing what you've lost becomes a very challenging conversation. And that is a conversation and an issue for leadership. That is a conversation issue for leadership then, because it is about risk to the business as much as it's about just affording to be able to keep all of this information across your company network. It's about value. Of course it is. Are you getting best value from your storage, and are you storing the things the business needs to function well? And truthfully, everybody suffers with rot. There isn't an organization in the world that's had an IT infrastructure for several decades now that doesn't have this problem to some degree, however good your housekeeping is. And I think, what we're looking at now is a new dynamic to that. And that is that, with storing lots of data, there comes a risk. There comes a risk of loss. There comes, lost opportunity cost, not being able to find the things you're looking for, but also that risk profile now. People are very familiar with, the risk of storing things and not reviewing where those things are stored. You forget where they are, and then you end up with multiple copies of things. And so the whole thing snowballs. And actually, from a data governance point of view, if we just look at, corporate responsibility and data governance, often it can be really quite hard to go out and just ask IT. They're going, well, we're standing this stuff up, we're giving you places to keep things, it's up to you what you keep there, business. And so the question of rot and why it matters falls into the cracks until a significant event occurs, at which point leadership is interested in why.
Let's go back. Yeah, I mean, you've really highlighted the fact that this is a topic that touches everywhere, and I think we'll get onto why organizations, because of that, find it difficult to prioritize and do something about it. We've got some examples in a second, but let's just quickly touch on the scale. We've got on the slide here something like 30% of all data is effectively rot. We know from Gartner studies that something like 12.9 million a year for a typical organization, poor data quality. And I've got some other numbers in here which I won't go through everything here, but $4.8 million per security breach, $2.7 million for a 100-size employee company in terms of productivity. I mean, I could go on, but this is real, and this is why it should be on every senior leader's agenda, surely, which is more surprising that in many cases it's not, given the examples I'm just about to share.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely correct in 2 points that you're making there, which are significant and relevant, to the audience we have with us today. And that is that, this data is created by people doing jobs. But actually the responsibility lies with leadership as well to ensure that, if the worst happens, that this data doesn't get out into the wild. So, that there is material cost to storing things. I think often we run away and forget that there is a material cost to storing data, and that data ages, like we all do. Data ages and becomes less relevant with time. And given those two scenarios, data also unfortunately duplicates itself rather effectively, particularly in a modern IT infrastructure. It's very easy to copy data about. And the temptation when you're looking at, doing that is to copy everything just in case you haven't got something you need, right? So proliferation of data is becoming a challenge, and data does run wild, in the hands of ordinary users who are just trying to do their day job, make their lives easier. Data does get out of hand, and part of the reason for that is because back in the old days when I started out in IT, storage was expensive. I'm not saying it isn't still expensive, but now the relative cost has gone down. So the thought processes for the last several years that have driven the reason why a business would care about this were not so much cost. They became, more recently, other things to do with data privacy, data security, GDPR, other responsibilities that a business has now to know what it holds and why it's holding it.
So Ian, let's keep hold of that, because I wanted to start to think more about some of the real world examples.
Yep.
And I know there's a couple here that are dear to your heart, and many of us have heard these stories. But what's the connection with something like rot? Just briefly, what's the connection with something like rot and some of these stories?
It's an interesting question, that Tim, because that whole rotten landscape of data, because we're not just talking about the data itself, actually, we're talking about where that data is, how many times it's been copied, so its proliferation across the network, its tendency to move towards, I'll have that as well just in case. And so you get data duplication, common cost of increased, storage costs is duplication of data. Sometimes there are legitimate duplicates, Tim. There's a reason to have, data existing in multiple departments because of the way that the IT team have designed people's logons to go to their, the finance area or the sales area of their data storage, and that's understandable. So there is such a thing as a legitimate duplicate. But actually, duplication is a massive issue. People will copy things without thinking about it, and then what you end up with, and again, this is very difficult thing for IT to keep a handle on all the time. So I think to say that all of the issue lies with IT would be unfair. It's to do with the businesses as well, and how it provides policy for these things. But you can see some significant examples here that I think probably most of us would be relatively familiar with. Data breaches now are becoming relatively common. This doesn't just happen to the big boys either. It's very easy to point at the big boys and say, well, yeah, of course, because they're a prized target for the kind of individuals and organizations that would want to do this holding data to ransom. The truth of the matter is, the tidier your data, the less cost footprint you have to maintain the currency of all of the data that your business needs to breathe and live. So its blood supply is data. So maintaining some degree of cleanliness in there is a good idea. And there was an old adage back in the day, Tim, there was a time when it was considered that storage was cheap. So why not just, when your dustbin's full, buy another dustbin? And what's changed more recently is that the risk of that data getting into the wild, it has become very, very real. And these on the screen now, we got some big brands. We all recognize these brands. And despite the fact that they would have, IT procedure and policy, they've all managed to get themselves into a situation where after a compromise, they have not been able to carry out their normal modes of business because they don't know where their data is in reality and what the exposure level is of that data in reality.
It's a real, I agree. It's a real element of kind of systemic failure. There's not one cut, there's a few cuts that lead towards it.
And I won't mention the one, by the way, but interestingly, one particular there that the attack came in through their supply chain.
Exactly.
So that control of data, even out into the supply chain, is becoming a very important element of the due diligence that IT and the business should be focused on. And obviously, business leadership, ultimately, the responsibility lies there. IT are the people that hopefully make your policy happen, but responsibility for this does lie with business leadership.
I agree. So I've got a question for the audience coming up now, which is, let's have some honesty here, guys. How big a problem do you think rot is in your business now? And my elves in the background will tell me when they've got some answers to this poll question. and then that will bring us into a little bit of discussion on the hidden risks of rot, and then we'll start to talk about what we're going to do about it. We got any answers, Ryan?
Yeah, we've got a few coming in. A bit of a mixed bag, to be honest. Most popular answer at the moment is a moderate issue. A few people with a major issue, and a few people who are unsure. So
Okay,
all over the place.
yeah. Ian, I'll put you back on the spot then.
Yeah, thanks, Tim.
Because is that a common view, given that you deal with it day in, day out?
Yeah. It's very interesting, Tim, and does reflect the sort of, what we see actually as an organization that deals with this. That there are people that recognize the risk and probably understand they might have a problem, but there are also people who are unsure. And actually, I think the people that know they've got a problem, that's a really good thing to say, look, I'm pretty sure we have an issue with this. To say I have a moderate issue, probably a balanced middle point to go, yeah, there's some of that, but we're not so bad. We're not so bad, and then I think the biggest element here is really to ask the question, when was the last time you actually took a look at this? In reality, when did you actually look to see where your organization is with all of these things? Because it's very easy to say, I don't know, or I'm not sure. And if you don't know or you're not sure, then you should. If you're saying high risk, medium risk, low risk, then all of those are good answers. The point is, though, data proliferation is a cost, right? So you've got a lovely picture of the iceberg. The bit above the water is the bit that everyone sees and uses every day and everyone knows about, and the rest of it is the stuff that sits under the water. You storing it, you're backing it up, you're probably never touching it, and sometimes you're keeping it just in case. And so that is where the risk and the problem actually lies, is not above the surface. Everyone's comfortable with the data that gets used all day, every day, probably to some degree in systems of record. It is the unstructured data in the, under the waterline there in that iceberg analogy. That is the issue, because that's the data that ends up in the wild if there is a breach. And that is the data that often people, you're paying every day to keep that data sitting there, getting older and older and older. You're backing it up, and so there is a financial and there is a risk to keeping data just lying around, because that old adage of when the dustbins are full, I'll buy another dustbin. That in the modern world now, that dynamic has changed very, very significantly.
Okay. So I'm conscious of the time, and because it's running away with us, and I know yesterday you said you could talk for England on this, and you're absolutely right. I think this is one of the questions which we don't have a poll for, but actually, actually we do have a poll for, but I'm not going to spend any time on that. So Ryan, if you could give us any details on that, because I need to start us to think about what we're going to do about this, because given the weight of the problem and the complexity, one of the challenges that we always get from people is I know I've got a problem, or I think it's a mild problem, so I'm going to put it away, but how do I get started? So Ian, I'd be very grateful if you could give us a view of a few of the remedies for and strategies.
Of course, Tim, and I think some people are already popping comments in the chat, which is kind of quite interesting. Yes, of course. I think policy. Most organisations will have a policy. The problem is data in the wild doesn't necessarily comply with the ideals of policy, and data gets copied, duplicated, forgotten about, orphaned effectively. And what we find when we do our discovery exercises is it is quite interesting to look at duplication. We see a lot of that. We see a lot of data proliferated multiple times. So effectively, that has a business cost. But we also see data that hasn't been accessed for extended periods of time. And what I mean by that is, some data you might only access once a year, and that's an understandable frequency because of the nature of the data. But, we've come across data that hasn't been accessed for decades, just sitting there in the background, quietly taking up space, being backed up, and all those things. And I think what it's about really is understanding what your current position is, understanding the exposure, understanding where cost efficiencies and savings can be made as a result of that, because, you know, storage is not free. And also, you know, duplication, that's a very important thing to look at. So, but we don't just stop there, because it isn't just about how many copies of something you've got, you know, it's also about who's got access to that information. So things end up sometimes being copied to locations where the original security policy, for example, that would restrict the user's access to that data is removed, because it's copied to a location where everyone has got access and they necessarily shouldn't. So this is about a number of things. Okay, this is not just about, you know, how big's the iceberg, how much of it's under the water. You know, this is also, you know, let's bring another element into this. Let's bring email into this as well. You know, email can be a huge challenge. Email is often used as a data store as well. You don't delete emails, some people never do. So this isn't just about files and documents existing, you know, on the company's network. This is also about email. It's also how much duplication is there, and it's also about who has access to that information. So we had a financial organization approach us, and really their objective was to not just understand the physicality of the data, in other words, what file categories there were, where that data was, what the security policies were for that data, but also they had a requirement to look at what physical content was contained within those files and folders as well. So we obviously can do that top level to say, what have you got and where is it? How much duplication is there? But also, you know, who's got access to it? That's a really important question. It isn't just where it is, it's who's got access and should they have. And then ultimately, you know, we drive down to, there will be in pretty much everybody's corporate network a set of data where there will be a compliance issue potentially. Certainly, I'm talking about financial services company here when I talk about content. And really that related more to, you know, their financial compliance, and what they wanted to understand is how much legacy stuff did they have, and the content in that data having information in it should not have. GDPR data it should not have.
Is there a gap here? I mean, do obviously everybody wants quick answers. I mean, is the gap, do we need tooling? Do we need process? Do we need people with the right kinds of responsibilities? How do you characterize the sort of practical elements of the way forward, and what we might need to do to structure our business and solve this, maybe with things that we don't have already?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. You know, data ownership, you know, senior leaders all understand their responsibilities around, you know, the data their organization creates. However, I think the problem with data is it is not in the hands of, you know, the senior leadership. It's in the hands of the entire organization, and people need to be able to effectively do their day job. So sometimes it can feel counterintuitive to put barriers in the way of people getting on with their day job. And that's largely what causes data proliferation. If you can't find something, you'll have it sent to you again, and you'll store it again, and multiply that by the number of employees and the relative ease with which you can do that. And you know, you get to a point where data sprawl becomes a thing. You know, data is duplicated, data does exist in multiple places, and you're paying to put it there, you're paying for it to be there. I think the secret here comes from truly, what do you know about your data footprint? Truly, what do you know about it? And most people say, well, you know, it's kind of in control, you know, we've got plenty of storage left. But really what this is about, Tim, is insight. It's insight into what you're actually storing and where you're storing that information. So it's not just about volume, which of course it is, because there's a cost to volume of data, but it's also about what is where, what is exposed, what is that, you know, what is the exposure of certain types of data ending up in places that they shouldn't really have ended up, but they do, because, you know, chaos theory dictates, you know, people will put things in the simplest place for them to be able to access it, and often that is not an ideal.
And I think one of the things I've seen in analysis work on this is it's clear there are certain pockets of growth of data in organizations that, that can be taken hold of and dealt with. So where is this stuff coming from, and why is it coming? And I think that's the simple question that often the tooling picks up.
I think it is. So this is about, what is it, who's got access to it, how many times am I holding this same data, at cost, clearly. And then, once you understand that landscape of the age of data, where it is, what it is, and that's the first activity that we'd normally undertake, is helping people understand where their information is, how much duplication they have, because those are the things that cost real money. Storing things multiple, there could be legitimate reasons for multiple copies, but often there is not. And then finally, and often, there will be a specific thing that an organization needs or wants to address relating to the content in those documents, and that's where we move into a phase 2 of a data discovery, where we find it all, we report back on it, we report on access, we report on duplication, and then we look at content for specific target groups of data where the content is unclear. So what that data contains is not clear. So we can do content analysis at that point too.
That brings us quite nicely then to well, we've got a question there which will be shared after. There's no poll with this one, but actually we put together some tips here, and this is trying to encapsulate. Now, clearly, we won't have time to go through all of this, but if we spend the next maybe 1 or 2 minutes, we've got simple things on here such as monitor and repeat. So put a solution in, and there are analysis tools out there. There are people who know about these topics. One thing here, which often is a bit of a surprise, is avoid things like SharePoint, where actually it's very hard to find information. It is unstructured, and consider something like a document management solution, which is designed from the ground up to help us avoid the issues that you've just raised with this. So a few things here. That point 4 about providing a single source of the truth. Absolutely. Let's provide a source of the truth that allows us to have, when we need it, let's understand which version of the piece of information that we are working with, so that we find the latest contract that we need, rather than the one that was something relevant a couple of weeks ago or years ago even. So any reflections on this, Ian, before we hand it over to the questions for the last few minutes?
I think, in general terms, Tim, what this is about is information is power here. There's no sort of accusation in my statement that I'm about to make, which is, when the dustbins are full, buy more dustbins. That has been the model, because the dustbins, the storage analogy, the dustbins have been relatively cheap. The issue is that data sprawl is a reality for most organizations, whether that's across departments who all want access to effectively the same data, but there's no central point for that. But people in the wild will copy data. That's a common practice. If you don't stop people, they will, of course, make their lives as easy as they possibly can. Now, all I'm saying is, over a number of months and years, that data sprawl issue, becomes to some degree unmanageable. And what this is about is really doing one thing first, Tim, without, wanting to accuse IT of just putting more dustbins in when the dustbins are full. What this is about is just bringing it back in, bringing back control, and to understand where the organization is. So, getting a handle on the size and nature of the problem. And I am not saying, I just saw a question fly, I'm not saying that proliferation of data existing in different departments because of logins and departmental need. There are duplicates that are legitimate duplicates. So not all data shouldn't be duplicated. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is, the problem with the modern IT infrastructure is it makes doing, saving things, copying big amounts of files all over the place. Very easy to do, relatively straightforward to do. And then it's about several other things, isn't it? It's obviously about efficiency for people, being able to access the things they need. And of course, we're not suggesting that that should change. But what it is also about is, there will be in all of the attendees, there will be structures that were created for very good reason and now are either redundant, in other words, not used by anybody anymore, that contain data, that is taking up footprint, that is potentially a risk. And so this is just about drawing this back in to understand the nature and landscape of the information you hold, to see if there are risk reduction, cost reduction. That's what this is about. And of course, those things are important to just about every organization out there. Particularly now we're seeing targeted attacks happening, and it isn't just the big boys that are getting targeted. And data at the edge of the network, that's easy pickings for people who are coming in and trying to breach, and destroy data. And also, it's the knock-on cost, Tim. The primary costs are, where do I store it? The secondary costs are, how much do I back it up? How often do I do that? And what you end up with then is that proliferation of cost that exists beyond the single copy of a file. You now have multiple copies, you're backing all of those up, and the problem perpetuates.
Let's get to those questions. We're in the last 5 minutes of the call, and
let's
I
take some
know
questions.
that there were a couple coming through. So go for it, Ryan.
Yeah, sure. So we had a firstly, just a little question we had early on about sharing, I think, some of the figures that, Tim, you were speaking about earlier, which of course we can share post-webinar. Then the first question we had was, don't manufacturers/businesses already have tools to manage outdated documents? If so, what gaps typically remain that allow rot to build up?
Yeah, that's a great question, and the answer is yes. Depending on the organization we're talking about, they do. Usually, interestingly, it's the storage businesses that like to have these tools to show you how full your dustbins are. And it depends, doesn't it, really? Because the responsibility for data tends to be quite departmental, doesn't it? So accounts are responsible for theirs, sales are responsible for theirs, the senior management team is responsible for theirs, and so on. But over time, what happens is documents become out of date and are iterated. Documents get sent and copied to other people who then store them locally as well. So in the wild, data doesn't behave the way you would like it to, unfortunately. Data does proliferate, it gets replicated and copied. And also data becomes orphaned. So, a department that used to exist and was called, I don't know, legal and compliance, suddenly, the compliance team are off over here because it's got a big requirement. Legal team are then off over there. Everyone, you've got 2 copies of that data because that's how everyone wants to do it. And they promise to tidy up after themselves and then don't. So, it's easy to see how proliferation, but the orphaning of data, it happens more commonly than people realize. A location is created for a reason, and at the time it had a great reason. Everyone worked using that space. Suddenly departmental structures and other things change. That data is orphaned, but you're still backing it up. It still exists. It's still accessible. And to some degree, it could still potentially be a risk and have value to a party that didn't have your best interests in mind.
Okay, let's get one more question in, and we'll need there's loads coming in here. So we're going to need one question and a fast answer. Okay, Ian?
Okay, I'll do my best.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. So the question is, are there situations where duplicates are actually legitimate and shouldn't be deleted? How do you differentiate between useful duplicates and rot?
Yeah, a great question. So yes, absolutely correct. Sometimes there are legitimate duplicates for departmental or other organizational reasons. Of course, that's the truth. And that is why, as part of the data discovery profile and exercise, there is a reporting backstage, which is critical because there is a reason for duplication sometimes. Having said that, 6-7 times out of 10, there isn't really a very good reason for duplication. But the whole point of doing an analysis and being aware of where your duplicates exist is you can make those decisions with impunity. You can say, I know why the data is duplicated in this instance, and that's fine. It is a legitimate duplicate. So this is all about information supporting your decision making, and the starting point for that is a data discovery, which gives you the information on which to base your decisions, and not, it stops it being guesswork. It's based on real data from your actual estate as it stands. And that means that management decisions that can be then made effectively, and those things can be implemented because we know what we're doing, we know why we're doing it, and we know the data that's a subject of that activity. So it's just about that transparency and clarity, and just understanding the data better so that you can make those decisions with some impunity, basically.
Thanks, Ian. I love that. Understanding data so we can make some decisions is a really nice place to end the webinar. Thank you for your input. There were a few questions that, of course, we've run out of time, so we weren't able to answer, but we will follow up when we share the slide pack. We'll put some answers in there. In front of you, you'll see a QR code, and we're interested in your views on this, whether it was useful to you, whether anything we could have done better. And the first 3 people to complete this will give you the opportunity to have a free ROT assessment. So that's quite a good offer there. Let us know your views. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Ian and colleagues sitting in the background. We hope you've enjoyed the session, and enjoy the rest of the day, and happy Christmas if I don't speak to you.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you.